All right, well, I got the video going. Hopefully you can hear us. Hopefully it's recording. So you can either watch it on Google Plus or this. New way of calling in, Googling in. We've got every option covered.
So I Google and the Mishnah class.
Yeah, the link that I invited you to, you can watch that through the link that I sent you.
To my Google, my Gmail.
Right, it's the Google Plus link. You were on it just a second ago.
Where is he? He's home?
Yeah, he's home. Yeah, there's a Shiva, so he's covering for the family. So.
Oh, somebody died?
No, not in his family. No, a friend of his wife's has a Shiva, and so she's there, and he's doing his duty as a father.
Oh, they say that I cannot join the call if I'm speaking with you in the phone. So I need to hang up the phone in order to watch all of you.
No, but wait a minute. But if you're on the phone, if you're on the computer, we won't be able to hear you. So it's probably better for you to hear and for us to hear you than it is for you to watch us.
I prefer to hear.
Yeah, I think hearing is better than watching. This is not meant to be a silent movie. I'm not Charlie Chaplin. So yeah, let's work with just the sound. You can always watch the video later if you want to see how I looked when I was explaining it.
That's fine.
Okay, all right. So let's go ahead and get this rolling. Because we're in the final chapter, Pesachim, chapter 10. We have made it all the way to the end with some fits and starts by the technology. But now we are here to the part that everybody is waiting for, the seder. Right? It's very, very telling that for us, the modern Jew, the seder is part number one, numero uno. It is the end-all and be-all for many people of what Passover is. And yet, when it comes to the Mishnah, it is stuck all the way at the back because the preparation for Passover, the removal of chametz, which also wasn't as complicated as it is today, comes first. And the main portion of our text is taken up with the sacrifice, with how you do the sacrifice, who can do the sacrifice, where you do the sacrifice, how far you go, how far you come. That was the main mitzvah of Pesach that had the most complication. But the seder was fairly straightforward. Once you got home and once you got to eating, it was pretty clear, as we're going to see. And really, there's only a skeleton of the text that we might find familiar. So the Haggadah has been added to, has been modified. It was and is meant to be a living text. It is the seder is supposed to be an active study, an active learning, and an active engagement of everybody going on around the table. It is not meant to be the static recitation of a book. So we're going to see what is the core, and we'll maybe talk as we go about how it's changed, how it's grown, and what that means. Sound good? Still with us, Natan? You there?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, chapter 10, Mishnah 1, begins with on the eve. Shall I go ahead and talk so I can make sure, because I really want to get through this because we're not going to have class for a couple weeks probably. I'd like to see if we can get through this in one. So let's see what we can do. Chapter 10, Mishnah 1. On the eve of Pesach, close to Mincha, one may not eat until nightfall. All right, so as you get near in the afternoon to Mincha time, you should stop eating and not eat until nightfall. Why would this be? Logical reason? So you're hungry.
Yeah.
Right? The whole point is that when you come to the Pesach meal, you should be hungry. And the only way to make sure you're hungry is that you have stopped eating. If you're snacking all day, that's not going to work. So they ceased eating earlier in the day than maybe normal to make sure you really hit the seder with an appetite. Part 2, even the poorest person in Israel must not eat on the night of Pesach until he reclines. So we know that one of the important parts of the Pesach seder is that we eat it reclining. We eat it usually reclining in a chair with a pillow or in a reclined posture. In the ancient world, they would eat in a reclined laying out, either laying on a lounge or laying on pillows on the floor. It was the ultimate symbol of freedom. Right? When you are laying down, you are not able to serve yourself, which means you have others serving you. And that is the sign of true freedom, is that you are completely liberated from even the burden of having to serve yourself. And so the posture of reclining was meant to symbolize that. Good? Questions? On? Okay. And attached to the end of here, and they should give him, referring to the poorest of Israel, not less than 4 cups of wine, and even from the charity plate. That means to say, even if one would not normally need tzedakah, even if this is how it has to come, you need to make sure that everybody has the minimum amount of wine in order to make the blessing on the 4 cups of wine during the seder. All right, so what have we got that's familiar here? Well, we got eating. We need an appetite. We've got reclining. Sound familiar? And we've got 4 cups. Sounds like our seder so far. Good? Okay, Mishnah 2, moving on. Now it gets different. Mishnah 2, they mixed him the first cup. All right, mixed? What do we mean mixing a cup? If you look in your modern Haggadah, the English translation is almost always going to say they pour the first cup. In the ancient world, you didn't just pour wine. Most wine was not kept in ready-to-drink form. It was a concentrate. It was a syrup kind of thing. I mean, don't think like syrup, like pancake syrup, but it was syrup. It was a concentrate, and you had to pour it and then add water, and you would mix it. Which also meant, by the way, that according to the estimates that I was taught, the average glass of wine was not as strong as the average glass of wine is today. So for people who complain about drinking 4 8-ounce glasses of modern wine and feeling a little tipsy by the end of the seder, it was not that potent back then. Plus, no one ever said you had to drink 8 ounces for every one of the cups of wine. So they mixed the first cup. You can insert the word pour in a modern Haggadah, but just keep that visualization of preparing the first cup. Beit Shammai says, first he blesses over the day, and then over the wine. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the Kiddush. And in the Kiddush has 2 parts. We have the Berei Pri Hagafen part, and then we have the Mikadesh part. We have the paragraph, 2 or 3 sentences, that is said for the day. Beit Shammai says, say the paragraph first, and then say Berei Pri Hagafen, the blessing over the wine. And Beit Hillel says, not surprising, first bless over the day, and then, first bless over the wine, and then over the day. First you do Berei Pri Hagafen, and then you do the blessing over the day, the Mikadesh. Now, what is the argument under this? Well, according to the Talmud, when they go into the roots of the debate, Beit Shammai is trying to say, look, it's the day that causes you to be drinking wine. Right? You would not be sitting down to the seder. You would not be having this lovely cup of wine if it wasn't Pesach. So why do you mention the wine first? Mention Pesach first. That is the essence of this moment, is the celebration. And the wine is secondary. The wine is attached to the celebration. Beit Hillel takes it a slightly different reasons, right? So first of all, they say, yes, but without the wine, you wouldn't be able to do the blessing over the day. We say Kiddush over a cup of wine, so we need to acknowledge the wine first in order to understand why we are able to then say the blessing. And secondly, there is a principle in Jewish law that when you have 2 mitzvahs, you need to do the more common mitzvah first. This is exemplified in our daily life by the order in which we put on talit and tefillin. Right? You put on your talit before you put on your tefillin. Now, there's nothing in the Torah that says talit come before tefillin explicitly, but we know that we wear a talit every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Tisha B'Av a little special, but later at least for the talit gadol. But here, the issue is, and tefillin is, of course, not worn on Shabbat and not worn on Chag, and different traditions on whether it's worn during Chol HaMoed. So you would talit on because it is the more common first. Well, we drink wine more often than we celebrate Passover. We don't only drink wine on Passover. So therefore, the blessing for the wine, says Beit Hillel, should come before the blessing for the day itself. Make sense?
What we really do in the gather?
We do the wine and then we do the day, just like we do on Shabbat. Exactly. So we say Brei Pri Hagafen and then we do the blessing for the day. Right? It's exactly the same pattern that we do for every other occasion. But it's an interesting philosophical debate. You know, am I drinking the wine because it's Pesach, or am I celebrating this blessing because I have the wine? Both make perfect sense. It's important to stick with the custom of following Beit Hillel and to do the wine first, but savoring why helps us grow from both answers, even though we end up only following one. Right? We still can have this idea of I'm only raising the glass because it's Pesach, not because I'm thirsty. Thank you, Beit Shammai, for reminding me of that. But I'm going to do the blessings in the order of Beit Hillel because I need the wine to do the other blessing, and the wine happens more frequently than Pesach too. Liberation is great, but day to day I also enjoy many fruits, and this is one of them. Okay. So far, the only difference that we've got, I guess we could say, we can add the word wine in here. So far, the only difference between our seder and their seder is they mixed and we pour. Not such a big difference. All right, chapter 10, Mishnah 3. They bring it in front of him. He dips lettuce before until he reaches the appetizer, then proceeds the bread. What's going on here, right? So the it that is being mentioned here as being so obvious they didn't even think they spell it out.
What? No?
The Pesach,
The Pesach.
the actual sacrifice, right? So the sacrifice at this point, after Kiddush, the sacrifice would be brought to the table, the meat of the Pesach offering that had been sacrificed, as we talked about. That would be laid down, and then you would have the karpas. That's what they're talking about, the dipping of the lettuce. And you would do that up until the point when you are getting ready to do the motzi. Right? When it's time to do the motzi, which is what they mean by lechem, they bring before him matzah, lettuce, and charoset. Right? And so actually in this case they're talking about lettuce meaning the maror. Right? You take the maror and the charoset. And the charoset, the first opinion here is saying, is not mandatory. Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Sodok says it is mandatory. Okay, so first of all, one thing that's noticed here is maror does not equal horseradish. Right? It is a bitter leaf, a bitter lettuce. Right? We have made lettuce less bitter through the way we breed it and grow it, but lettuce used to be much more bitter, and that was the key form of maror, of bitter herbs. Horseradish was not used in the ancient world. It wasn't used until very recently in Jewish law. They didn't have gefilte fish. They didn't have simmus.
Yeah.
There were a lot of the dishes that were different, but this one is rather important because maror is generally considered to be a mitzvah. And in fact, there are many authorities that say you can't do the mitzvah of maror with horseradish. When you read through Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, and other things, they're very, very clear. You can't use a root in order to fulfill the mitzvah of maror. It has to be an herb. It has to be something that's leaf based. So I highly recommend endives, a good bitter rocket. There's certain types of romaine you can still get that are quite bitter. definitely do those. Go ahead and put horseradish out there as a garnish, but for the maror mitzvah, do it with a leaf. It's what they did, it's what the halacha is, and our ancestors only ended up with horseradish because they were stuck with nothing else they could find that worked for the mitzvah. But really, they were bending the rules, and we live in an era of abundant vegetation. We can do better than horseradish. All right, charoset. We all know charoset as being this mud-like mixture, usually based around apples, added in dates, maybe figs, maybe almonds, maybe walnuts, maybe wine, maybe cinnamon. There are hundreds of different recipes. Every family has their own preference. Every community has their own basic template. But it is a sweet dish that looks like mud. It's sort of the basic definition. And do we say a blessing for charoset? Do we say a baruch atah for eating the charoset? Right, we say one for maror, we say one for matzah, but we don't say one for the charoset. So then do I have to eat it? If I don't like charoset, am I okay? Right, I get my maror, my dippable maror, remember, not charoset paste, not horseradish paste, but dippable maror, a dippable leaf, and we dip it in the charoset. That's the dipping that's being talked about here, and then we eat it. But do I have to? Is it a chiyuv? Is it an obligation to eat the charoset? According to the general comment here, nope, no obligation. According to Rabbi Elazar, there is an obligation, but it's interesting. Why does he think it is mandatory? It doesn't say here, but if you read other commentaries and the Talmud later, he explains quite clearly the reason it's mandatory is for your health. That eating the bitter herbs, eating maror straight without anything to dim the bitterness of it would be unhealthy. And you have to put it into the charoset to help take away a little bit of the sting of the bitterness so that it won't make you in danger. So that's why he's saying it's mandatory. Again, it's a very interesting metaphor that we, as much as we wish to relive and re-experience the bitterness of slavery that our ancestors felt, we do not want to endanger ourselves in the process. And so we have to blunt that recreation a little bit with the sweetness of charoset at that point. And in the temple, so in the temple days, they would also at that point bring the body of the Pesach before him. This is when we would do the actual presentation of the meat, also known as the meal. This is when you actually begin the eating, but we're going to get to that part a little bit later. All right, so that's Mishnah 3. Mishnah 4? I know everyone's going, wow, the seder is quick. All right, chapter 10, Mishnah 4. They mix. Yeah, question?
Sorry, I meant because I meant something that you say that what was mandatory there at the time?
Charoset.
Charoset was mandatory.
Well, it's not mandatory, but everyone said you probably should have it because it helps keep you safe from the bitterness of maror.
And that's the only reason, not because represent the marker of the working issue.
It definitely represents that as well. But as far as the idea that it would be mandatory, the idea that you really should, it wasn't just its symbolism, it was its medicinal purposes.
So it was only about health, not about symbol.
Well, I don't like the word only. It was first about health and second about the symbolism.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Mishnah 4. They mix for him a second cup, right? And here the son questions his father. I think you might know what's coming, right? You mix the second cup, and now it's time for the son to question the father, to ask the questions. If the son lacks well, okay, hold on. What are we talking about? Right, but this is the Magid, right? This is the telling of the story of the Exodus. And the first thing the Mishnah mentions when we reach the telling of the story of the Exodus is that the telling of the story should be in the answer to the questions of our children. And this doesn't just mean children like, tiny children. This means all the way up to adult children. But when the Pesach evening is described in the Torah, and in general, future generations are described, over and over again, we are told we have to teach our children and we have to answer their questions. Right? In fact, we are told that 4 times, surprisingly enough. Now, the Talmud in the Yerushalmi in its own way, and then the Haggadah in its own way, will take those 4 times that we mention answering the questions of our son, including the unasked question, and they turn that into the 4 sons. They turn that into the idea that there are 4 sons and there are 4 different ways to answer, as there are 4 different ways to ask, and we create a whole narrative in the Haggadah. Here, it just sort of slides past that. Just the son questions his father. And only if, part 2, the son lacks the intelligence to ask, then the father instructs him. Then the father will teach him, on all other nights we dip once. On this night we dip twice. On all of the nights we eat chametz or matzah. On this night only matzah. On all of the nights we eat roasted, stewed, or boiled meat. On this night only roasted. And number 4, there is no number 4. All right, so the 4 questions aren't 4 in the Mishnah. All right, the 4 questions are 3. Right, so 4 questions are 3 questions in the Mishnah. And look at those questions. Do we notice any differences? Right, on all other nights we dip once. On this night we dip twice. What does our current Haggadah usually say? Afilu pa'am echad. We don't even dip once, but on tonight we dip twice. Why did the question change? Because our eating changes. Right? In the ancient world, dipping was a major form of eating. And to this day, if you go to Israel with the resurgent Israeli culture, you'll often share a meal where there are lots of dips and things, and you'll put in bread and dipping and eating, and that's a big part of eating, is sharing lots of dishes that are all being dipped into throughout the meal. And in the ancient world, so too. But in our world, we don't dip so much. In fact, most of us don't dip hardly at all. Not till the reinvention of salsa and sour cream and onion did we start getting dips again, I guess. But for a long time, people didn't dip at all, except on Pesach. And so the question for Pesach used to be we dip once, but now we dip twice. And the question for us is we normally don't dip even once, and now we dip twice. The question fits what the child experiences, because the questions, the experiences were designed to create the question. The entire seder was orchestrated to be weird and to be a deviant form of feasting. This was not your regular party. And that's really, really important, because everyone in the ancient world knew what other parties looked like. We knew what Greek parties looked like. We knew what Persian parties looked like. We knew what Roman parties looked like. And this was supposed to have the best elements of feasting twisted in order that we would ask, why are we doing this in this way? To get back to your question of symbolism, Natan, everything was meant to be done a little differently to get people asking. So that's our first difference. On all the nights we eat chametz or matzah, on this night only matzah. Yay, that one is the same still, as that is not going to change. Although I always feel a little funny because most people I know don't eat matzah the rest of the year. It is technically allowed to eat matzah the whole rest of the year, but most people don't. But since we're allowed, the line stands.
But I thought that you are not allowed also to eat matzah very often. like at least not the day before the Pesach.
Right before Pesach, in order to make the taste of matzah seem new, you go on a little bit of a matzah fast. You don't eat matzah right before Pesach. But for the whole rest of the year, it wasn't a case of don't eat it so often. Matzah was default. Letting the bread rise took time. Mixing the dough, slapping it on the oven, and cooking it and eating it right away, that was the easy, normal way of eating. That's fast food for the ancient world. So matzah would have been quite common.
So like you say that there's here 3 questions. I see 4. You got the first question, we eat chametz and matzah. The other second question about bitter herbs. Third questions about the roasted.
Okay.
And the 4 questions about the not the deep once but twice.
Where do you see the question about bitter herbs?
On all night we eat other greens, but on this night bitter herbs.
Oh, okay. I know what.
The 4 things they start with on all night. Is the beginning of each.
Okay.
Sentence.
So here's what's happening, Natan. Your copy of the Mishnah, because you're not using the handout that I use. Your copy of the Mishnah is used a more updated version of the Mishnah. If you look at the oldest manuscripts of the Mishnah, if you look at the oldest handwritten copies of the Mishnah, it does not mention maror. Right? The oldest manuscripts of the Mishnah have only 3 questions. Later medieval printings added in the question that we have in our Haggadah. But that is not part of the ancient manuscripts of the Mishnah.
So they trick me. They need to return the money.
They should have put a footnote, and maybe they did put a footnote. I don't know. But yes, the inclusion of the bitter herbs line is definitely a later addition. It is not part of the original Mishnah.
Okay. And why was added during the Middle Earth?
Well, because everybody knew the question. It was an obvious question from everybody's Haggadah, and it was sort of considered standard. And whoever copied the Mishnah at some point probably felt that there must have been a mistake in his version because it only had 3 and everybody knows there's 4, and so he added it in. Probably somebody who was well-meaning added it in. The other theory is that someone added the line from our Haggadah in the margin of their copy to compare and remind themselves of the bonus one that we now have. And then the person who copied that version put it into the main text thinking that it was meant to be in the main text. So there are lots of ways that manuscript traditions, we've seen words go from the margins to the main, or somebody who thought there was a mistake fix it by adding in something that fits but wasn't there originally. That's one of the reasons why the rules for creating a Sefer Torah, for writing a Torah, are so precise about how you do it exactly in the same font, the same way, the same letter shapes, everything in order to avoid these problems, because our ancestors knew that copy manuscripts wasn't the same as a photocopy. That you had issues with scribes tweaking things for the best of reasons, and sometimes innocently, just by mistake, and didn't even realize they were making a tweak, but it does allow things to creep in over time. And not just here, but in other places, we know that other manuscripts of the Mishnah are different than the Mishnah that was commonly published by the end of the Middle Ages. And not major differences in most places, I should point out. Just like here, we're not talking about a huge difference, but little things here and there that definitely crept in over time. The fact that there are so few of them, given the size of the Mishnah and the length of time that it was transmitted, is impressive. But definitely a few things did get in. Which brings us to our question number 3, which is the roasting. And we don't ask that question anymore. Right? No one sits around the table saying, why does it have to be roasted? And you remember when we went through the Mishnah about the roasting of the Pesach, it was very, very particular that it be roasted exactly the right way because of the need to have it be roasted according to the words of the Torah, rather than any other possible wet form of cooking. But nowadays, we don't have the Pesach sacrifice. We don't eat the Pesach sacrifice, so the particular roasting of it doesn't stand out. So who's going to ask the question? Now, remember, these were not meant to be questions that were hypotheticals. These were meant to be questions that the kids would see around them. These are the questions that the youngest child, the one who can't ask for himself, should be taught. Look around you. Do you notice the things that are different? Look over here, David. We're dipping twice now. Isn't that different? Isn't that unusual? Let me tell you why. And look, we're only eating matzah tonight. I know normally sometimes we have matzah, sometimes we have chametz, but tonight only matzah. Isn't that strange? Look at that little David. And then we can have a conversation. You're teaching the kid to notice things. You're teaching the kid to go, wait a minute, hold on, why are we doing it like that? And these are the examples. This is not the definitive list, right? So if anyone ever asks you, and by the way, this is a great trick question for your own seder, to ask the people around the seder, how many questions are there in the seder? And every time someone says 4, you can go, eh. There are as many questions as you can come up with. We start with 4 just to get the ball rolling. And we start with these 4 only because these are the simplest of questions. This is not college level work questioning here. Right? This is the most basic rudimentary form of questioning. We are supposed to get better and more detailed and more exacting and more careful and more inquisitive as we grow and as we have a seder year after year after year. So find something new to ask about for your seder. If you're the one leading the seder, ask it before the seder so you can find an answer, and then share what you were wondering and the answer you found with the people around your seder in order to prompt them to come up with their own questions too. All right. He begins, part 3, he begins with shame and concludes with praise, and expounds from a wandering Aramean was my father, or alternative translation, hotly debated within the commentators of the Torah, an Aramean tried to destroy my father, until he completes the whole section. So this is the section that is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, the declaration that was used when a person would bring their offering of the first fruits, the bikurim, to the temple in Jerusalem. And it is a short paragraph that is a thumbnail synopsis of the entirety of our people went down to Egypt, they were slaves, and we came out. And it does it very, very concisely. It starts with the bad, and it ends with the good. That's what they mean by the shame and concludes with praise. And we take it from there. But that is only supposed to be the skeleton explanation. That's the minimum needed to tell us what the story was. But it is meant to be asked about and explained about and wrestled with. And what about this and what about that? Or do you think it might have been? That is what the rest of the Magid is supposed to be. So they don't give us the entirety of all the midrashim that have been crammed into our current Haggadah. They give us, start with this and use it and go from there. Fill it in with your own questions. Everyone should be talking and asking. And they shouldn't be asking, when do we eat? Make sense? All right, so we have in the modern Seder Haggadah, we have what looks like a fixed Magid, a fixed retelling of the story, with page after page after page of very careful, very erudite explanation and questions built in to the story itself, whereas they had an open Magid. They had a Magid that was based around a very short text from Deuteronomy. It's chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, verse 20 to 25. We're looking at 5 verses, and then they would expound upon that. They would expand upon that. They would ask about it. That was what they then did. Make sense?
So always they give us the two options of the story, that you could start from Abraham, or you could start from the time that we went to Egypt. Well,
so the option is how you tell the story. What I would recommend, if you have a group that is interested in a more free-flowing Seder and a more open Magid, use the text from Deuteronomy. keep with that core of our tradition and talk about why would they have us talk about our story of the Exodus in this way? Why did the rabbis not encourage us to go back to Abraham first, or even back to Adam Rishon, the first man? Why would we start with this text, and what does it teach us about what they wanted us to learn from the Seder retelling? Because there's a lot going on in this little text of why it's being used from the time when we're celebrating the first fruits of the land of Israel, hint, hint, kind of important connection there to the Exodus, of why it starts from our shame rather than from Abraham, which was one of our spiritual high points. This is really trying to set a certain mood, a certain atmosphere that is meant to be how we re-experience the Exodus. If we only... You go ahead.
So the rabbi preferred that we start from Deuteronomy 26.
Exactly. Deuteronomy 6, 20 to 25 is the core of the Magid as far as the rabbis of the Mishnah were concerned. Where you go with that, well, why did we end up in Egypt? Why was an Aramean either my wandering father or chasing him? Why was that happening? That's a great question to follow up. But you start off with the idea that we were down in Egypt as captives. Or when we were in Egypt, we became captives. We want to be emphasizing the degradation of Egypt first in order to make sure we can properly celebrate the Exodus. If we just look at the time in Egypt as being a blip on the radar between Abraham and Moses, then we don't have a proper appreciation of what the liberation felt like and of how miraculous it was. Make sense? Okay. Chapter 10, Mishnah 5. Okay. This may sound more familiar. Yay, familiar parts of our Haggadah. Rabban Gamliel used to say, whoever does not make mention of these three things on Pesach does not fulfill his duty. And these are the Pesach, matzah, and bitter herbs, maror. The Pesach, because the omnipresent passed over the houses of our fathers in Egypt. The matzah, because our fathers were redeemed from Egypt. The bitter herb, because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our fathers in Egypt. All right. It's really, really close to what we currently still say. Anyone notice the differences? It's shorter. Right, so the main difference is it's shorter. The idea that these are the three things, that's almost verbatim from what our Haggadah currently says. But the explanations are each a few sentences in our modern Haggadot, and it's only one sentence in Rabban Gamliel's original thing. Again, Rabban Gamliel, when he said this, did not expect it, to be written down word for word and recited as liturgy, as a prayer that was exactly like that. He expected this to be, you need to talk about these three things, and here is the main topic sentence for each one of the three. Now, talk more about it. Ask questions about it. Fill in the blanks. You're not supposed to just say, the Pesach, because the omnipresent passed over the houses of our father in Egypt. All right, I'm done. You say that, and then everyone says, well, why did he do it? How did it happen? What did it mean? Is that why we have the fast of the firstborn? Is that why the firstborn are considered consecrated to God and we have Pidyon Haben? Well, I don't understand. Well, how does the animal sacrifice have to do with the passing over of the angel of death? Wasn't it the matzah that was important, or the blood on the thing? Well, the blood on the doorpost was the actual blood that was taken from the Pesach offering. So that you can... It's supposed to be, again, a organic discussion, not a static recital for all of them. Because, for some reason on this copy in smaller print, in every generation, a man is obligated to regard himself as though he personally had gone forth from Egypt, because it is said, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of that which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. Therefore, it is our duty to thank, praise, laud, glorify, raise up, beautify, bless, extol, and adore him who made all these miracles for our fathers and ourselves. He brought us forth from slavery into freedom, from sorrow into joy, from mourning into festivity, from darkness into great light, and from servitude into redemption. Let us say before him, Hallelujah, right? And that section is absolutely taken, has been taken as being part of our modern Haggadah. That section there at the end, it is our duty to praise, and it is our obligation to feel. Those are recited during the Pesach, but we shouldn't just recite them. We should understand that this means go beyond the text. Because you can see, if you did the Seder as word by word, the rabbis have recorded here, the Seder would be done in about 10 minutes. Right? There's not enough, nice. Pardon the joke, there's not enough meat on the bone to fill up the entire night. And yet we know that the rabbis considered it to be praiseworthy to fill the night with the retelling of the story. Okay.
So because at the end you have this Alleluia, is that why we say all the song of Alleluia?
No, we say Hallelujah. Why do we say Hallelujah generally, or why do we say Hallelujah in the Seder?
In the Seder, because here they say that, so let us say it for him, Alleluia. But in Haggadah, you have like a big part, at least another 5-7 minutes, you have a long song with Alleluia.
Okay.
That is the reason that we have the long song, because that sentence?
No, the reason we have the long song is because Hallel is considered part of the Seder. And Mishnah 6 picks up on that theme. So Hallel is the Psalms from 113 to 118, and Hallel is part of the Seder. It's divided between before the meal and after the meal. Really important that people remember, come back after dinner. There's still a lot more of the Haggadah left. But if you look at Mishnah 6, we're going to see that they have a little bit of an argument about it. So how far does one recite it? That is to say, how much do you read of Hallel before the meal and then finish the rest after the meal? Where do you stop before you eat? And Beit Shammai, go ahead.
The song Alleluia in the Seder is before or after the meal?
That's after. The song that you're thinking about comes after the meal.
Okay.
That's part of the additional songs, which are fulfilling the idea here that, lefichach, it is therefore our duty to praise and extol and sing and laud. That's why the songs were all added, was because we wanted to do more. We don't want to just do the minimum. And people wrote them in like a songbook because they were good. But one part that is considered to be more than a songbook, but an actual requirement, is Hallel itself, that special collection of Psalm 113 to Psalm 118. So how far does one recite it? How far do you have to sing before you eat? Beit Shammai says, until as a joyous mother of children, which is the end of the first psalm. And Beit Hillel says, until the flinty rock into a fountain of waters. And the argument, according to the Talmud, between the two of them, since they're only arguing about a difference of one psalm, is Psalm 113 doesn't really mention the Exodus yet. It just mentions that God is wonderful and has done wonderful things for us. And the idea for Beit Shammai was that since we have not yet, in the evening of the original Seder, experienced the redemption, we shouldn't say the rest of Hallel until later in the evening. Right? He was trying to get Beit Shammai, English. Beit Shammai was trying to get the timing of Hallel to match the timing of the Exodus. To which Beit Hillel responded, yeah, but we didn't really leave until after midnight the next day. Because midnight's when the plague of the firstborn happened, and that's when the Egyptians drove us out. So are you trying to say we're supposed to finish the meal after midnight? Because as we're going to see, that's not allowed. So Hillel says, nope, it's fine to go ahead and do the first psalm of the part that actually talks about Egypt, and that's Psalm 114, and then you can eat. Make sense? Good. So part 2 goes on to say, and then you conclude this section with a formula of redemption. Rabbi Tarfon says, who redeemed us and redeemed our fathers from Egypt. But he did not conclude with a blessing, no Baruch Ataz. And Rabbi Akiva said, so may the Lord our God and the God of our fathers bring us to other appointed times and festivals which come towards us for peace, rejoicing in the rebuilding of your city, and glad in your service. And there we will eat of the sacrifices and the Pesachim, until blessed are you who has redeemed Israel. Okay, what's the difference between the two? Apart from the keeping a blessing or adding a blessing or no blessing. Past tense, future tense. Right? Rabbi Tarfon is all about, Passover is about God redeemed us from Egypt. Done. And Rabbi Akiva is about, just as you redeemed us from Egypt, so may you also lead us to appointed times and festivals where we can rebuild the city and offer the sacrifices, which in the days of Rabbi Akiva was not possible. Rabbi Akiva and Tarfon were contemporaries, I should point out. So Rabbi Akiva was basically saying we should use this opportunity to think towards the times of Mashiach, to think towards the time of future redemption. And Rabbi Tarfon was saying, nope, we're just focusing on the past redemption. Now, we don't have any proof, but this parallels their debate over the messianic aspirations of Bar Kokhba. Right? Bar Kokhba was a leader of the Jewish people in 134, 133, 133. I've lost my math. Anyway, around the 130s, the Common Era, led the big revolt against Rome, won for a few years and got destroyed. Rabbi Akiva very famously said that he should be considered as Mashiach until he fails. And Rabbi Tarfon said to Rabbi Akiva, Akiva, the grass will be growing out of your cheeks long before the Mashiach comes. Meaning, Mashiach is not coming in our lifetime. So there was a debate about whether or not we should be eagerly anticipating the restoration now, or whether we should be saying celebrating the past is enough. Now that may be behind this argument over how the blessing should be phrased. We do a bit of a combination of the two. In the modern Haggadah, I mean. Good? Good. Mishnah 7. Time for Birkat Hamazon. They pour him a third cup and he blesses over the meal. It was customary and still is for these types of meals to do a blessing over the wine as you do Birkat Hamazon as well. And then a fourth cup is poured or prepared, and he concludes Hallel, and he recites over it the blessing of song. All right, so Natan, you asked, what about all these other Hallelujah songs, the Nishmat part, all the other things that get included? These are included because of this phrase, that over this final cup of wine, we also add additional songs of blessing. Make sense? I'll take that as yes. Part 3 is a very important thing to remember. Between these cups, meaning between the second and third, you can drink. But between the third and the fourth, you don't drink. So if you want to have your second cup of wine, which is the one that we do the blessing on right before the meal, if you want to drink during your meal, another glass of wine, 2 more glasses of wine, you still have to stay awake. More wine, no problem. But as soon as you lift the cup for Birkat Hamazon and you do that blessing, that's the end of the wine. From then on out, the only other cup of wine is going to be the fourth cup. Clear? And that is still the how our Haggadah is and how the halacha is. I hope that you're noticing as we go through this.
Now, you don't drink more after the dessert because you already did Birkat Hamazon.
Exactly.
But if you want to just innovate and put the Birkat Hamazon after the 4th cup of wine, yes, you could drink between the 3rd and the 4th.
Well, we already do a blessing after the 4th cup of wine. We do the blessing we do anytime we drink just a cup of wine. But we don't add additional cups of wine, and that's going to lead us into Mishnah 8, because the rabbis wanted to make sure that this party did not get out of hand.
It's not Purim, Pesach.
It's not Purim, and more importantly, it is not one of the Roman or Greek parties, which was all about the wine. So if we look at Mishnah 8, it says, one may not conclude the Pesach meal with an afikomen. Now, this is a very complicated phrase for the understanding. So because afikomen literally means a after party. We use it now almost as satire for the last piece of matzah that we eat. But originally, the word afikomen did not refer to that piece of matzah. It referred to the additional gorging and partying that would happen after you finish the party at one person's house and you move to the other person's house. It's like a pub crawl. You know, you go from place to place to place, drinking, being sick, eating, carousing, and all the other things. And that's living. And they said, no, we're not doing the afikomen thing. So instead, our afikomen, our after party, is a tiny piece of matzah. Not tiny necessarily, but I mean, it's a piece of matzah rather than another orgy. Well, not another orgy. We don't have even the first one. Rather than we don't have another drunken party. We just have this, and the finish is with matzah because that is what it should be the final taste in our mouth. That is what we should hold on to, along with the last cups of wine. And now comes the big problem. If some of them fall asleep, they may eat. That is to say, they may eat of the Pesach when they wake up. All right, so someone falls asleep during the Magid, during the telling of the story, which, remember, they didn't give us a whole lot of text, which means it has to be generated by our conversation and by our learning. But someone falls asleep during that, if they wake up, they can still eat from the Pesach. Even though they missed part of the seder, they can still eat from the Pesach. However, if all of them fell asleep, they don't get to eat. If everybody around the table was asleep simultaneously for some period of time, then the collective was broken. The seder was ruined. And I'm sorry, you don't get to eat because it's not that kind of party. Right? And Rabbi Yossi says, well, if they napped, then they may eat. But if they fell asleep, then they may not. He tries to sort of hedge his bets. He says, no, if you fall asleep, you get yourself kicked out of the seder. But if you're just dozing, you know, your head's nodding, but as soon as they say, hey, David, you wake up and you say, yeah, then you're okay. That would be okay.
No, but I understood that if some fell asleep, they might eat. Like, if some of the people slept, no, doesn't matter if it's big or not, they can eat. The problem is when everyone sleeps at the same time. And Rabbi used to say that it's concentrated about individual, not about collective.
Right, yeah, he's saying as long as they weren't really, really asleep, that it's okay. As long as they're just napping,
So
dozing.
For him, if everyone is napping at the same time, it's fine. The problem is when everyone is snoring.
Yeah, although I would say Rabbi Yossi probably wouldn't say it was fine. He would say you are still allowed to eat from the Pesach. There's a difference between saying it's okay and if it happens, it's not so bad. I don't think he was recommending that people would nap. And then if you nap, you'll fall asleep. All right. And now we're down to the end. Chapter 10, Mishnah 9. The Pesach defiles one's hands after midnight. What in the world does that mean? Right, the Pesach, okay, we know the Pesach, we're talking about the sacrifice. The sacrifice that had to be brought in purity. The sacrifice that had to be eaten in purity. The sacrifice that went through all of the details of the service in Jerusalem that we discussed. If it's after midnight, it's not no good. Your hands become tameh. If you touch it, your hands become ritually impure. What in the world is going on? this is a preventative measure to prevent people from eating it after the time they were supposed to eat it. Let me finish the Mishnah and you'll see what I mean. So the pigul, right, and the remnant, the notar, also defile one's hands permanently, right? So the pigul are the parts that were not eaten out, that were non-eaten parts after the time from which it must be done, and the notar are the things that were okay, but the time for their eating has expired. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay. Okay, let me back that up. So notar is the easier one to get, right? The notar is the expired sacrifice. You were supposed to eat it within 3 days. It's now 4 days. It is notar. It is the remnant that is left over. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the pigul, on the other hand, is that if something, if you have the different parts of the sacrifice, right? Make sense? Well, you have the different parts of doing the sacrifice. Okay, no? Okay, I'm trying to see if you're listening. Okay, so here, I'll read you the explanation that's in he explains it shorter. If one of the 4 parts of doing the sacrifice, slaughtering, catching the blood, bringing the sacrifice, or burning up the extra, or sprinkling the blood, if one of those 4 parts for a sacrifice is done while intending to eat the sacrifice or burning up the non-eaten parts on the altar, after the time in which this must be done, the sacrifice itself is considered pigul and has to be simply burnt. All right, so if you sacrifice it with the intention of doing it at the wrong time or eating at the wrong time, then the whole sacrifice is nullified and you don't get to eat it. But what they're adding here is that it defiles the hands. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain this in modern terms. All right, here's how we go. Let's see if this works. Imagine you have a friend, and your friend tells you, "Oh, you shouldn't drink too much coffee. It'll give you cancer." Right? Now, the person they tell that to, right? When they tell you that, they may be using the term cancer because they want to impress upon you how bad coffee is. Now, coffee isn't really that bad. Coffee does not actually give cancer, as far as I know. I'm not a doctor and I don't give medical advice. But someone might use the term "it gives cancer" as a way to discourage someone who normally wouldn't care about regular health benefits from doing something that they think is really, really bad. Right? So it is a way of putting something off limits to even people who normally don't care about those things. So when the rabbis say that the Pesach after midnight is defiles the hands, the pigul defiles the hand, and the remnant, the notar, defiles the hands, what they are doing is putting up a barrier to the less careful that will make them keep this mitzvah of not eating them at the wrong time. Because the temptation to eat it was huge. Because it was food, and food was precious. Still is, we just take it for granted. And the rabbis instituted this to say, even people who are generally not careful about the mitzvot and who might go ahead and eat this if they think they can get away with it, they will be careful if I tell them it defiles their hands. Because the idea of being tameh is the kind of thing that, especially in the ancient world, although many moderns couldn't care less, but in the ancient world, even people who weren't so religious, they cared about whether their hands became ritually defiled.
Now, you told Rabbi that the leftover you could eat for another 4 days.
No. It depends on the sacrifice, but the standard sacrifice had a 3-day time limit. Pesach was midnight.
Okay.
So
That's the part that I couldn't understand. Because if you can eat for 3 days and now you cannot eat after midnight, there is a contradiction.
right. Yeah. No, the first part of the Mishnah, the first line is only about the Pesach, and the second line is about other types of sacrificial problems. And they both have the same ruling, which is they defile the hands. Now, it may seem strange to us that people who didn't care about the mitzvah would care about ritual impurity, but we do see this over and over again. You know, there are people who will keep certain mitzvot very, very aggressively because they think it brings good luck, even if the mitzvah has nothing to do with good luck. If they think it brings good luck, or if breaking it will bring bad luck, they'll keep it, and they'll keep it hardcore. Other mitzvot, which are more important, more central, more just everywhere in Judaism, you know, so I'm doing, you know, I'm cooking on Shabbat, big deal, you know, but little things that they think matter for luck, they will do. I always said that if God had told us that keeping the commandments was lucky, we would have had no problem, because people are willing to keep superstitions, but not commandments. And what the rabbis are saying here is that in their days, ritual impurity was an issue that everybody cared about, even if they weren't super religious. And therefore, putting this in as a protective measure kept people from breaking the actual commandment by working with what they were already sensitive to, which was ritual impurity, which was tuma. All right, part 3 is a slightly different topic, and then we're going to finish. If he recited the blessing for the Pesach, that is to say, to eat the Pesach offering, he thereby exempts the sacrifice, the Hagiga. Remember, that was the bonus meat in case you didn't have enough of the lamb to feed everyone enough to be full. Everyone still had to eat from the Pesach, but they may not be full. But if he recited the blessing for the Hagiga, the sacrifice, he does not exempt the Pesach. That's the words of Rabbi Ishmael, which is basically arguing that the Hagiga is subordinate to the Pesach offering, and therefore if you say the Pesach blessing, you've covered it too. But the other way around doesn't work, because the Hagiga is not more prominent than the Pesach. And this is similar to the way that we'll say the blessing over lechem, the bread, in order to cover all the other food on the table. But we don't say a blessing on other food on the table to cover the bread. And Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Rabbi Akiva says, nope, neither one exempts the other one. Meaning you have to say a blessing on the Pesach, and you have to say a blessing on the Hagiga. And you have to say a blessing on the Hagiga, and you have to say a blessing on the Pesach. It doesn't matter which order you eat them in for the blessing. Each one is a separate entity and deserves and requires its own blessing. Make sense? And that's all you need to know to do a seder, according to the Mishnah. Right? It's not very long. The core of the seder is tiny, because the seder is supposed to be huge. Right? They didn't need to write a book, because everybody should be celebrating the celebration of Pesach by just asking questions, telling stories, sharing teachings, saying, I heard once from a rabbi, there was a midrash I saw, the movie with Charlton Heston doesn't even come close. Talk. That is what the seder is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a service in the sense that you sit and you recite from a book. Using the book as a launching pad, absolutely great. And that's why so much good material has been added to the Haggadah over the last 2,000 years. Because people came up with good ideas of the 4 sons, and the idea of, all the midrashim about, my father was pursued by an Aramean. We've come up with lots of good teachings about all of these things. And so we added them into the text in order that we could expand and expand and expand our telling. But that text shouldn't be a straitjacket, right? Add so much more from yourself. Tell and retell new questions every year. That is what the Seder is supposed to be. The halacha has not changed. The core elements have not changed. 4 cups of wine, maror and matzah, the recitation of Hallel, the telling of the story itself in its core form, the songs after the dinner itself, that hasn't changed. That we have those requirements.
You forgot about Rabbi Gamliel.
Well, Rabban Gamliel is part of the core mitzvahs. Yes. Yes, the mention of the 3. But like I said, I mean, Rabban Gamliel is all of what, 5 sentences? We're not talking about a major narrative built into the core material. The narrative is supposed to come from our hearts. We are supposed to be retelling the Exodus like we were there to our children so they understand what it means. And think of how you would tell that story if you were there. Would you read it from a book? Or would you read from the book as though it were your words? And would you add your real own words to go along with that story? Right? This is not reading Shakespeare in the sense that you have to read only the lines on the page. The lines that are there are meant to inspire us more, not to limit. So as you get ready in a month and a half to celebrate Pesach, amongst all of the other work of preparing the meal and of cleaning the house, prepare yourself to tell this story. Find out what you want to say and let yourself say it, and find ways to encourage the people around your table to say it too. We were all there leaving Egypt. We all have our story to tell. Find it and share it. And with that, a very, very early Chag Sameach.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Rabbi Ishmael is